Welcome to Leading Beyond Limits, the podcast where we explore the extraordinary journeys and insights of remarkable leaders who have pushed the boundaries of what's possible. Your host, Angel Radcliffe, who is a digital transformation leader, author, speaker, and financial educator, will lead each episode and dive deep into the stories, strategies, and philosophies that have empowered these exceptional individuals to lead, inspire, and achieve beyond the ordinary. We're about to embark on a journey of discovery and inspiration, and together, we'll learn what it takes to lead beyond limits. So grab your cape, or at least your favorite coffee mug, because we're about to unravel the extraordinary tales of trailblazers who've turned impossible into I'm possible. Let's get started.
Victoria, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
I'm so excited to have you on and talk about my favorite topic, leadership, or I should say one of many, one of many favorite topics, and especially empowering women in leadership. So something that definitely needs to be honed in on. And I think everyone's excited to hear what you have to say. And before we get into all of those nuggets, I would love for you to share more about yourself and your journey and how you got to where you are today.
Sure, happy to. I'll try and be as concise as possible. And that's because I feel very old as I tell you. I've been working for 30 years and I've spent the last almost 24 at an executive level. I was recruited directly while in college, I should say. I worked for a bank and stayed there and decided to postpone law school because I loved the business world and got recruited out into my first executive role to be the chief operating officer for a large BPO company, which stands for business process outsourcing, which was a massive stretch role for me. I had been running large contact center operations in the banking world, and this BPO company was predominantly contact centers and had many banking clients. So I ticked many boxes and showed up, but their imposter syndrome was real back then. And I realized I loved the business to business professional services world and have stayed there ever since, operating at an executive level. And in some cases, focus slice on the B2B world. I spent a decade running corporate travel businesses. And then almost the last 10, I've been running human capital businesses or engaging at the intersection for CEOs and board members with transformation. And then also I'm a board member, a public speaker, an author, and I'm a wife, mom, fitness fanatic, foodie, and wine lover. That's about as concise as I can be. How's that?
I love it. I love it. And I as I mentioned before we started recording, I love your background and everything that you've been doing. 30 years that's a very long time to not only gain experience, but to learn from any mistakes or work towards mentoring other people, empowering other people. In those 30 years, if you could choose one moment that's very memorable to you as far as shaping your career, what would that be?
Now, I should say 30 years. I started working at age 11. So actually more than 30 years, because I will be 48 this year. There are some pivotal moments for me, and actually taking the leap to leave a quote unquote safe environment. I'd worked for many years in a bank, and I'm originally from Canada. Big 5 Canadian banks are some of the most stable environments to be working in. I left that to take this very large stretch role. And I was a brand new mother. I also made a decision to have children young. So I had given birth to my first child just before my 24th birthday, and then took on the C-suite job shortly thereafter. I'm a big believer that if you do not step into the things that make you uncomfortable, that the growth doesn't come. And so that was the first one. And it was really bold at a really time in my life where there was just so much change, even in becoming a new mother. But I think that has very much set me up for the rest of my career. As I said, I love the B2B world. And I also never went to law school, which was the plan since childhood, because I realized how much I loved being a leader in business and engaging teams and going all the way from strategy through to execution, but really doing that from a team perspective, the leadership piece I loved. So that was probably the most bold move, and the one I look back on that was instrumental in bringing me to where I am today.
Nice. So you were in a leadership role at a very early age, I would say, as opposed to most people when you look at their career journeys. Can you think of one piece of advice that you would have given yourself stepping into that role?
100%. I look back on it now and I think I use the phrase imposter syndrome. I don't actually really like it, but I do think that the phrase, but I think it's a good way of just describing a little bit how I felt. And so the advice I would, have given myself is that it's okay to be my authentic self. And by that, it was because I was the only female executive, I was the youngest by 20 years. I am part of the queer community. I was married to a woman for 11 years before now being married to my husband and with him for 10. And so I felt I was the only one in the room on many fronts. And because it was a stretch role for me, the last thing I was going to do is demonstrate any vulnerability, any sign of emotion, because I didn't want to give anyone a reason to question me and my seat at the table. And so I found out I was given the nickname as the Iron Maiden. I found that a couple of years later. And it's actually so not who I am innately. Like I cry at Humane Society commercials. My best friend has nicknamed me Turtle. Tough, resilient exterior, but soft and marshmallowy on the inside. So I'd love to go back to that 24, 25-year-old girl and tell her it's okay to be you. Because when I finally realized it, it was just so freeing.
I'm stuck on Iron Maiden and wow. I feel like we as women, we have a very hard time when it comes to, I'm not going to say working towards our goals. I feel as though we have a hard time from a societal standpoint as far as the things that we can handle and that we have to be tough. We have to be resilient. We have to do all of these different things. And one of the things that comes up in constant conversation is how do women excel with having to play so many roles in society? And when you said when you said that comment about that, I was like, oh my gosh, this is describing so many people who I know who are just trying to be tough and stand up for everything and show that you're not weak. Because if you show any signs of weakness, people say you're not ready for a leadership role. Or if you complain about one thing, it's always tied back to something, something that we as women have to go through, such as like motherhood, if you're a mother, or there's so many things. I can go down the list, but is there anything in particular when you found out you had this nickname, anything in particular that sort of went through your head that you would have wanted to change in that moment of the person that said that?
But actually, it took me a few months to really react to it. It came, I heard that I had the nickname. It came on the heels of doing some significant performance management and restructuring. And so at first I was like, that's unfortunate, but it's probably because I've had to make all these really tough decisions. I had a conversation a few months after that with a colleague, a peer. We were talking about our weekends, and I said I had been to a movie and was bawling, and I didn't have enough Kleenex. Little tiny like popcorn napkins just wasn't enough. And she looked at me and she's like, Vic, I thought you'd be the type of person who laughed at people that cried at movies. And that is actually when it all came together for me. I'm like, maybe that's what they mean by the Iron Maiden. If you think I am devoid of emotion because I'm not showing it at work, and then I could possibly laugh at people who express their emotion. That for me was, I realized, one, that's not it's not who I am. Two, that's not the kind of leader I would want to work for. And that three, like perception's reality. So I am going to have to change the way I show up. And it wasn't comfortable because I was worried about how I'd be perceived. Would people think I'm soft? Would people think I'm weak? And now I am actually a very confident, I'm a tall woman who hit my height really early. So I have this like big person feel. Like I'm only 5'8", but I hit this height at like 10 or 11 years old. I was taller than my teachers. And so I come with this big, not only big personality, but a great deal of confidence. So I think the fact that I then just was able to show emotion and not be questioned, I do think a lot of it's societal norms. And then if we jump to later being questioned for, I made decisions not to take maternity leave, my choice, and then had people trying to give me excess mom guilt that I already had. Because again, there's these sort of norms that people think in terms of how we're going to act and what we're going to do.
Absolutely. And I'm still stunned. I'm like, Iron Maiden. I know there's so many connotations, but I can only think of the negative ones. Like,
Yeah, I know.
what the heck? Okay, so we'll switch off that subject, but I'm just so stuck on that. I'm like, what in the world?
Yeah.
Okay. Victoria, your career journey is very unique. Of course, everyone's journey is unique, but yours is extremely unique as far as how long that you've been in these various leadership roles. What do you attribute to your success other than getting started at an early age?
A few things. One is an incredible amount of resilience. I overcame pretty significant trauma in my youth, and that ability to deal with that kind of adversity has helped me in life, period, but very much from a career perspective. I've now been a part of probably close to 40 merger, acquisition, or related transactions, almost 20 of them within the companies I worked for. Two are companies, actually three are companies I've bought or sold myself. And that comes with change and the ability to handle adversity. So resilience is one, and that's a big part of my why. I'm just driven to be better than the biology or circumstance of my own lived experience. The next is around just performance. I have an exceptionally high work ethic, and I learned very early on around how success gets measured in organizations and developing the skill to be a high performer. And when skills, right now, the shelf life of skills are rapidly decreasing. And so continually making myself at the forefront and gaining new skills. And then another would be personal brand. I've moved companies every few years by choice or through some of these M&As, and I'm usually recruited into roles as a result of having a very strong brand, not just of performance and work ethic, as I've said, but of things like values, integrity, and some pretty strong things that differentiate for me from others who do maybe what I do or have similar experience to me.
So you mentioned something that that hit the nail on the head for my next question. You talked about skills and being a high performer. When it comes to women in the workplace, what do you believe are those essential skills needed to navigate someone into their next leadership role?
Oh, there's many. I've focused on what I refer to as whole human leadership. And some of this is my learnings from Iron Maiden to like the fully embracing the turtle that my best friend calls me. So I think that's important. I would be telling women as they're navigating whatever their journey looks like. And one thing I will say is don't let anyone define that for you. You go as far and wide as you want. And the fact that you might choose to have children and what that means, and that doesn't need to stop you. I see people, many women, park their career for a period of time. And if it's by your choice, great. But don't let it be one that's dictated for you. So you're the CEO of your career. And so figure out what that is. I sign a lot of my social media posts with two hashtags. One is unstoppable. And that's my life's philosophy and mantra. Nothing is going to stop me from achieving the goal or objective I've set for myself. And the other one's no excuses. And that is you have choice in terms of how you're going to react and respond, whether it's things that are in your control or those that are not. Doesn't mean you don't have the emotion deeply when a challenge comes your way or there's some kind of adversity, but you do have choice in terms of how you respond. So I tell women to chart that course for yourself and don't let anything stop you. You have your career in your hands. And so also don't rely on that single boss or mentor to do it for you. You need to be a very active participant in taking you towards whatever your desired career journey or objective is.
Being unstoppable, or you said you use that hashtag. When I think of unstoppable, I think of someone who's more of a fearless leader, and you're going to conquer everything that's put in front of you. I think we're both thinking on the same page with that. But we're thinking that unstoppable is the equal to being a fearless leader. How would you tell someone to approach that concept, to step into being a fearless leader? And what are some ways that someone can overcome self-doubt? Because you talked about imposter syndrome, and I know that's a big one for so many people, for women in particular.
Yeah, some of it comes with, in my case, maturity and the confidence that comes with age and experience. Because I think when you're earlier in your career, for example, it's hard to say no to certain things. So being a confident leader, and by the way, we're all leaders in business, whether you have a title or hierarchy. But what I'd say is you need refer to in one of my books 3 acts of engagement, and the first is courage. You need to be bold to do this. And for me, that means like I'm very values driven and high degree of integrity, and I want to do the right thing. But we're challenged in business often with that. And so you need to be courageous and bold to do those things. But you also need to be, as we talked about, vulnerable and be authentic in terms of taking those steps. And those are like, it's a lot harder than to do than when you're in that moment, for sure. So just step in and own it again with courage, vulnerability, and authenticity.
Do you feel as though as a woman, it's more difficult to be vulnerable and authentic?
Yes, I didn't, as I explained in my early years, because I was afraid that I would be viewed as weak, and have people question me if I showed those vulnerabilities. If I talked about, I have a pretty horrible early origin story, but that's actually a big part of why I am driven, is because I'm determined I'm going to be better than the alternative path I could have gone down given those circumstances. But I wasn't going to tell anyone that. It just gives them a reason to question me, or where I don't have this fancy Ivy League education or a family pedigree. So I hid those things. And I think many women lack a lot of confidence, period, but showing vulnerability, whether that's talking about lived experiences or emotions, just causes them to be concerned about people around them questioning them and whether they're going to get that promotion or how they're going to be viewed.
Definitely. And I think it creates somewhat a little bit more challenge, as well as incorporating additional bias that we already receive as women. For someone who's trying to navigate that landscape of challenges and bias in the corporate environment, is there any advice that you'd like to share there?
Sadly, it does still exist. I can't tell you how many times I've been called the B word in business, where my male colleagues are applauded for similar actions or language, or even just, and this is a smaller one, to be called aggressive versus assertive. So I see that regularly. And we continue to, many companies are doing bias or unconscious bias training, but the reality is we all need to call it out when we see it. I think our voice is our power. And I would just like tell them, going back to authenticity, it's a heck of a lot easier just to be myself than to cover or put a mask on temporarily. And so I just encourage women to like just step into their authentic selves. And if you're not everyone's the turtle like me who's going to cry like it so dramatically at movies or the Humane Society commercials, and that's fine. Like, you do you, but be you. Like, that's what people do business with, people they like and they trust, and therefore they want to do businesses, whether that's buying from someone or hiring someone. That comes through like authenticity, not just the credibility you have of what you do and the experience you have, but building those kind of trusted relationships. And I think that's more important. And so I would just say to women, lean into it. It might feel uncomfortable, but I think that authentic self is actually what will propel them even further along.
Oh, definitely. Now, I want to change the perspective because I know we're talking about like how do you navigate this as a woman, but let's think about as a corporation. And it seems as though you've led some large organization or components of large organizations. How can organizations play a more critical role in creating those inclusive and supportive environments for women?
Oh, so many ways. I think I've worked for like some really large companies, and there's one I can think of where we did such a good job of hiring our entry level fresh out of college hires. There was one year 53% were women. And I whatever the job band is, but then once you got 2 or 3 levels higher, we saw a massive decline. And think about this 5 or 7 or maybe even 10 years later. And a lot of this is when those women were choosing to have children. So what does that look like? So I think it's a lot easier now in a much more of a hybrid environment to create more of the flexibility for those that now have responsibilities on the greater responsibilities on the home front. So I think that's important. But it's also creating and the inclusion piece, much like sure policies and procedures and whether it's benefits for maternity leave and things like that, but it's that inclusive component. I spent a lot of my career in commercial client facing roles where, the expectations of how I was going to entertain my predominantly male clients were in things that were not inclusive for me as a woman. I did them, but those were expectations you think of for, not that golfing's a male sport, certainly male dominated, but to the bars and these sorts of things. So I think there's a significant amount of mindfulness around what inclusion looks like for women, the language that gets used. Again, as we think about the way in which we engage with our female colleagues and creating much more flexibility. I have this saying, I've had it long before COVID with my teams: there are no schedules, there are just deliverables. So can we create that kind of outcome-driven environment and trust, particularly our female employees who tend to bear more of those responsibilities? And again, we're still in heavily male dominated from a leadership perspective. So how can we teach them to become much more allies and understand what inclusion means for women?
I love that. And you mentioned something that just set off a light bulb. So you said more than 50% of entry level hires were women. Now, and I know the percentage decreases significantly when you start to move up the ladder and into mid-level management, senior management, executive type roles. Is there any particular instance in your experience that you've seen a number of women executives being brought on at a company?
I've seen it attempted for sure. I've been leading human capital businesses for a while, so really focused on the workforce and usually providing an element of DEI consulting or training for clients. And so I'm very aware of a lot of the data, and I see them attempting to do it, but even failing at the board level. There was an engagement I worked on within the last couple of years, and it was with a large financial services company who was looking at their DEI strategy, but their board of 20 something people only had 2 women. Like, it starts from the top. When I worked for IBM, and Ginny Rometty, our CEO, the CEO, said, "You cannot be what you cannot see." And I love that. And so I do think it starts from the top, but it goes back to, are you creating a great culture and environment that will keep them? I see so much effort going into talent attraction, but not into retention. And that retention goes back to, again, culture. Place, do they feel like it's a place they can thrive? Do they feel a sense of belonging? And that's the part that's missing, which is why there then tends to be such turnover. And then you look at smaller companies. You and I have both worked for some pretty large ones, but venture capital, only 4% of venture capital funding goes to female founders. By the way, less than 1% to Black founders. So there's a problem systemically with how we're looking to support women, whether it's founders or executives, and creating better places to work.
Absolutely. And you talked about retention. I think that's a good one to hone in on because from what I've seen in my experience, companies do a very poor job at working towards retaining their employees, especially when it comes to leadership development, which is one of the reasons I'm having this podcast, and my newsletter is really helping our colleagues and other leaders, emerging leaders, understand different issues in the workplace. How do you handle those issues? I think companies do a piss poor job of leadership training, especially when someone gets promoted into mid-level management. I've come across so many people who don't necessarily know what to do. They've never led a team. I've come into contact with people in executive roles they've never led a team ever. And I was like, how did you make it this far in your career? They don't know how to connect with other people, and it ruins the experience for teams. Now, I understand that there are individual contributor roles, but going back to leadership development and training, most companies have a 1-day session and say, watch these videos on YouTube, whatever it is internally.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do you retain your people if you're not training them to be better and you're not developing them? And even with mentorship and sponsorship, because I know we're talking specifically about women and advancing their careers in leadership, there's so many companies that don't necessarily advocate and have these programs in place. So my question to you, Victoria, is what advice would you give to someone who is at a company who is trying to advance into a leadership role, or maybe they've already made it into that leadership role, and they don't have access to resources such as development, training, or even having a mentor at their company?
Your voice is your power. And as I said, you're the CEO of your career. So do not wait for someone to like bestow this upon you. Ask for it. Speak up for what you believe is needed within the organization. And I'm a big believer, control what you can control. And so try to make the change there. And if you cannot get them to do it for whatever, they're not there, there's not funding, there's this, there's that, then go and get it yourself. Seek out, there's lots of like leadership development courses, self-help books, podcasts, all these things you can use to help improve. Again, I hope companies are going to invest in that. But sadly, one of the first places that companies cut when it comes time to cost-cutting measures is the learning and development budget. Sad, but true. Make sure you are taking your own development in your hands, pushing for the company to help support it, but getting it outside if you can't find it there.
It's really great advice. Awesome advice. And I know that you dropped a lot of gems. You've given some great information. And one topic I really want to go back to, I know towards the beginning, we were talking about societal norms and balancing these different identities that we have as women. I want to know what strategies that you found helpful to manage that work-life balance for women in leadership.
I'm atypical. And so I'm a little bit of do as I say, not as I do with my team. And so but I have this saying that where there is conviction, there is capacity. And that goes a little bit to my no excuses hashtag. So you will make time for the things that matter, both personally and professionally, number one. But two, recognize that comes with compromise and trade-off. You can have it all, not always at the same time. And you'll make some decisions that are right in the moment, which might be more for career at one time and then for your family at others. An example for me, took little to no maternity leave with each of my two children. That was my choice. And I respect women who want to take much longer, some maybe who opt to stay at home for a period of time while their children are younger. Again, you do what feels good for you and your family. My choice was not to, particularly with my second one, took no maternity leave. There was 1 year when my younger one was 2 years old. I spent 220 days on the road, of which that's roughly how many business days there are. So I also didn't take vacation that year. And so I missed out on many things. However, years later, when my ex-wife, and we were divorced, but we shared custody of our children, when she passed away from her second round of cancer, I was in a job that I loved, but I traveled 50 to 70% of the time. I tried to change jobs within my company to one that would have way less travel because I didn't have any other family and I couldn't find one. So I had to quit that job and I took a role that was less fulfilling for me, but had me home for my children. Get comfortable with figuring out what trade-offs you're going to make and when it matters. And to, again, not feel guilty for that. I've had lots of people try to make me feel guilty for some of those life decisions, particularly when I put career sometimes ahead of some family commitments. But I feel like I've made the right choices at the right time. So find out what you have great conviction for and create the capacity and learn to say things do not bring me personal or professional joy or value. I don't do them. I say no, I outsource, or I delegate. And that's a big way in which I've been able to get all that I do done.
I love it. Victoria, you are a public speaker, you're an author, and you do so many things. Entrepreneur, Jane of all trades. There's so many. When you are speaking and you are out here sending your messages in regards to leadership, what are some key pieces of advice that you typically share with your audiences?
I speak on a handful of topics besides the kind of pure business stuff that I do for work. And it is on a big one is around resilience and overcoming adversity and how to do that in a much healthier manner. I speak on a lot to do with around the advancement of women and other underrepresented minority groups in owning our career. What's that strategic intentionality we have? To personal brand is a really big one. As I said earlier, I think that's been a really key part of my career success. To talking about whole human leadership, how to lead in a very different way. And one, I had to retitle it because it used to be called Future of Work, but the reality is Futures here. Like, how do we just lead teams in a very different way and look at skills and skilling and workplace and some of those dynamics very differently? But ultimately, the message I leave is one of, I hope, both motivation and inspiration, but empowerment with some actionable things you can do in terms of, again, owning your career, owning your brand, charting your own course, and recognizing you are in charge with this very different mindset of having choice and no excuses in achieving those goals and objectives.
Nice. Now, with your books, you have two and a third that's coming out.
Correct.
So Influence Unleashed, and then you have Unstoppable. So which one was the first book?
Unstoppable. I was approached by a publisher to be a co-author, and that one was a little easier. I just had to contribute one chapter, but that's my philosophy. I'm like, this is serendipity. So that was the first one, Unstoppable.
And tell us about Influence Unleashed.
So this one's on personal branding, and I decided to write it because I'm seeing just such a huge uptick. Like companies and people are really understanding the power of, we understood influencers, but we're thinking about that from a TikTok and Instagram perspective over buying consumer goods. But that's particularly in the business environment, like more and more companies are focusing on developing that within their people, lots of people in career transitions. And yes, it's an area I know exceptionally well. In fact, when I worked for IBM, LinkedIn ranked me as IBM's #1 social seller worldwide. And that has a lot to do with your brand. It also has to do how you engage with your network. And so IBM asked me to develop training for all of its executives. And so I started to more formally educate because of that. And I do speaking, but more recently, I just seen people get it wrong or they stall at only one piece. So I decided to put together what I believe are the various facets to your brand, which I have 4 foundational areas, whereas most people only focus on the first one, which is like your subject matter expertise and in what industry you do it.
I think personal branding is definitely key to excelling in your career. And especially when you want to move to a certain level, any advice that you can give to someone who, let's say, they're trying to move into that executive role, something that they can do to enhance their personal brand or even get it started?
So particularly at a leadership level, it's when you make that move from being like an individual contributor to stepping to being a leader of people, and then maybe even a leader of leaders, it's very different skills. And so you want to start to articulate more than the fact that you've got expertise in a function. And the 4 foundational elements of brand, in my opinion, are 1, the subject matter expertise, what you do, again, what you're known for. Although you do need to start to speak to the skills you have in leadership as well as part of that. That needs to become part of your vernacular, your elevator pitch. But the next one is more to do with who you are as a person. Storytelling. What lived experience do you have? What can you bring to the table? What makes you unique around your passions, your values, your interests? Then it's what makes you different from others. Why would I want to promote you into this leadership role versus another? So what's that differentiation? And that's actually one that's really difficult for people. And sometimes it's a blend of your storytelling and who you are with what makes you different, but get good at articulating those things. And then I also ask people to start with the end in mind, legacy and impact. What do you want to be known for? Now, that's a lot easier later in your career. Like at 20, I probably couldn't have articulated that. Certainly not the way I can today, but tell all of those things. And the other is there's a little bit of courage that has to come with that, particularly like you got to be humble, have humility, but you actually still need to tout your successes. So figure out a way to do that. And that becomes a little more art and science and bringing the data together, science in terms of fact and how you've been successful, what you delivered, but the art in terms of storytelling. So you still come across with that with great humility, but learn how to do that. That's exceptionally key. And I think when I'm looking to sponsor someone within the workplace or someone who's I'm potentially going to promote, it's a lot more to do, not just with their performance, their potential, and a lot has to do with who they are as a person, because I look for fit and someone who I think is going to have a great trajectory.
That's really great advice. And we've had a really great conversation, and I'm very sad for this to be coming to an end. I was sitting here taking notes, and I was like, gosh, there's so many other topics that we can segue into. And you talked about owning your career, and I love that phrase. I say that all the time. You have to own your career and learn to say no. And there's tactful ways to say no and to move things in the direction that you want. And I was like, that can be a whole nother episode. We'll have to have you back.
Definitely.
I'm like, definitely. I definitely appreciate you being here and sharing all of your knowledge. You've dropped several gems. And typically, the question that I like to ask at the end of the show is like, share something that our listeners can take with them on their own path to leadership. And you've shared several things, but I'll ask one more time. Anything else that you'd like to add to someone's notepad?
Here's one of my favorite quotes, and it's by George Adair. And it says, everything you've ever wanted lives on the other side of fear. And with that, I talked about stepping into my discomfort at some point. But I think that's really important. You can chart your own course. You're the CEO of your career, of your brand. Being bold and authentic, all of those things take courage and require you to step into some fear, into the thing that makes you uncomfortable. So I'd tell your listeners to embrace that, because I think opportunity and growth comes by doing that.
Thank you for tuning into another inspiring episode of Leading Beyond Limits. If you enjoyed today's conversation and want to hear more from our incredible guests, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback means the world to us. And if you have a remarkable leader in mind who you'd like to hear on our show, or any questions and comments, feel free to reach out to us. You can find our contact information in the show notes. Remember, leadership knows no bounds, and with the right insights and determination, you too can lead beyond limits. Until next time, keep reaching for the stars and leading with purpose.